As we head into the firewall section here, we're going to talk about some strategies for deploying firewalls before we actually get to the labs. We've got some CCP work with firewalls that I know you're going to enjoy. But the first thing I really want to bring to your attention is that while a firewall can be a dedicated device, and gosh, we've got corporate firewalls now, you've got a personal firewall, it doesn't have to be a dedicated device. Anytime that we prevent traffic from flowing from point A to point B, in effect what you're doing is firewalling, regardless of the device in use. Some traffic, as I mentioned on the board here, is naturally firewalled, if you will, because if traffic can't get from one point to another without intervention from us, it is effectively being firewalled. And again, a lot of the time, you don't even really think about it that way. Take VLANs, for instance. Early on in our CCNA studies, if you studied that with me, we did a little lab where we had 4 devices in one VLAN, and they were in the same address space, and they could ping each other with no problem at all. But then, when we put them in separate VLANs, even though their IP addresses were not even on the same subnet, they were sequential, they couldn't ping each other anymore. Well, in effect, we had put a firewall there. Now, again, it's not something you really think of as a firewall, but it is. Because really, what we're doing is when we're working with a firewall, we're firewalling for 2 reasons. The first one is we're stopping undesirable traffic from entering a given area. And that could be as large as our entire corporate network or as small as a subnet on our internal network. In case of a personal firewall, when you're out at, say, the coffee shop or something, you don't want to go through their wireless. You're going through your own, you've got your little personal firewall. What you're doing is stopping the bad guys from coming into your laptop or your tablet. We also want to allow desirable traffic to flow while monitoring it. And this can be a little bit of give and take here as far as what kind of traffic we're going to prevent and how aggressive we're going to be. And we're definitely going to talk about that in this section. It is not just theory that you need to know for the exam. I'm definitely going to share some real-world tips with you as far as firewalling goes in this section. And speaking of that, let's talk about some best practices with firewalls to begin with. First, if you have a firewall in place, traffic should have to go through it. It's not going to be an option. And a couple of things that we're going to look at here for best practices, and it probably includes this one, you just go, duh. Thanks for sharing that. But you'd be surprised how many times over the years I've seen admins like, if it's just painful for a certain bit of traffic to go through the firewall, they'll work around it. Or they have let's say, much more common, I would say, is a situation where you have multiple entry points to your network and they're not firewalling all of them. That's just not something we want to do. That is not an effective policy. Now, speaking of that give and take, remember the default settings of any firewall. I don't care what vendor you buy it from. I don't care if we're talking personal firewall to huge corporate firewall. It is very rare that the default settings of that firewall are going to match your network's exact needs. This is a starting point as far as those default settings go. It's not an ending point. You can't just put a firewall in, click it in, and then hit 2 buttons and say, okay, we're done. It is something that needs to be fine-tuned over time. Now, one simple defense is not enough today. And what you should do is consider taking what we call a defense in-depth approach. And what this is, it's really a layered approach to your network security. And I'm going to share a document with you either at the end of this video or the beginning of the next one. And I'm not going to post it in Udemy for you to download because they asked not to do that, but you can get a copy online very easily. And it's an excellent guide to what we call defense in-depth approaches. Because what you don't want, you don't want that one fixed defense that if the intruders get past it, if the attackers get past it, then everything's fine. The document I was referring to when I was reading it had a great analogy about a bank. If you had all this money in the bank, which of course that's what banks do, you wouldn't want just one vault door and that's it. And if they get past the vault door, then they're in. They get all the money and there's no other defense. What you want is a layered approach really going from the outside in. Because, having a firewall is nice, but as I mentioned, it's not the ultimate nullifier. It's not going to take care of all your business for you. Now, Your firewalls belong at logical attack points, such as the router connecting your network to the internet. What you do, simply, is look at your network from the outside and look at it from the angle of someone who's going to attack it. That's the way you have to think. You just say, if I were attacking this network, where would I go first? Where would I go second? Where are those points of attack? Now, again, the middle point here, you're better off firewalling a lot of traffic and then adapting by allowing traffic as you go along, as opposed to not firewalling a lot of traffic at the beginning and letting something nasty into your network. You want to err on the side of filtering too much traffic, frankly, at the beginning when you're working with a firewall, because you're quickly going to find out from people, because believe me, when they can't do things or something doesn't work, it's like, hey, we need to punch a hole in the firewall to allow such and such. But what you want to do is be very stingy about the traffic that you are allowing through the firewall at the beginning. Because if you go the other way, if you take a liberal approach and say, okay, well, we're just going to stop these well-known enemies, these well-known baddies, and we'll let everything else in, that may not be the best approach to take. Because, above all, you don't want to wing it with your firewall. You know how I've told you in other courses, when it comes to ACLs, you really want to just get away from everybody for a few minutes, put it in writing, go from top to bottom, and just see what the logic of your ACL is? Well, you want to do this with your firewall as well. Get your policies down in writing, get them approved by the appropriate persons, and then start firewalling. That's what you've got to do. Now, logging is something that's really, really overlooked. We tend to just forget about it sometimes. But what you want to do is you want to log traffic that is being stopped by your firewall. Because if you are being attacked somehow, from the outside, from the inside, doesn't matter. If you're being attacked, it's not enough to defend against it. You want to defend against it and know that it's happening. Because otherwise, it's just, you've got to have that notification. You've got to know, hey, last night, somebody was sending packets from 0000 and I think they were malicious. You don't want that kind of thing to happen and not know about it. Now, your written policy should not be static. Therefore, it should be dynamic. It's not something you're going to change every day, but you can't just write a network security policy in today's world. I'm sure you'd agree with me and say, this policy is good for the next 20 years. I never have to think about it. That's not going to be an effective way to go about business. Now, deciding on the filters to place traffic, there's a lot here, because we've got to decide. You could filter traffic with any combination of the following. Direction. Do we want to filter traffic that's coming into the network? Do we want to filter traffic going out of the network? The source and or destination IP address. There are IP addresses that you would know immediately. It's like, do we want to let packets into our network that are sourced from 0000? We probably don't want to do that. So we could decide on filters as far as source and or destination IP addresses go. Who, where, and with what? This is one of my favorites, because you have to decide, should people on this subnet be allowed to go on the web and do such and such, at 4 o'clock in the morning. You can't just say, okay, we're going to allow all web traffic all the time, or we're never going to allow web traffic. I remember when schools first started getting networked. I was working for a local school system, and it was just crazy, because one of these things was like, and if you can imagine such a thing at the time, it was a lot of the admins, it was just easier for them to say, well, we never want anybody going on the internet at all. And of course, as time went on and we had more and more web-based apps, not just for the students, but for the teachers, that really, that's an example of a security policy that could not remain static, because you've got to be open to change. And it's rare where you can just say, okay, well, this protocol can't be used, or we're not going to use this service, or we're not going to allow this subnet to do anything. It's who, where, and with what. Who do we want to allow to do things where and with what protocol? Now, permit any. I'm not saying you're never going to use this in a firewall, but I always say, really, just be careful when you start doing, permit anyone to do this, permit anyone to use this protocol at this time. Just be careful with those permit alls or permit any's. Now, let's talk about the good things about firewalls. First off, of course, they prevent unauthorized users from getting into our network to begin with. They're going to prevent viruses and other nasties, malware, just about anything from getting into our network. When I wrote that, do you remember that when, if you're relatively new to networking, you might not remember this. Remember when cursors were a big rage, like animated cursors? You know, you got Dilbert cursors or something like that. This was a while back. Well, so it's the kind of thing where you just don't want people downloading anything they want to anytime in your network. Prevent some users from accessing sensitive data. Again, if we are restricting access to records, especially medical records, if you're running a network for a hospital, you don't want just records. You are effectively firewalling those medical records when you say, here are the people that should be allowed, here are the people that shouldn't be allowed. You're also preventing recon attacks. And this is a reconnaissance attack, short for reconnaissance attack, I should say. And the recon attack in itself is usually not devastating to your network. Actually, with a recon attack, the person who's behind that doesn't even want you to notice it, because what they're doing is gathering information for a future destructive attack. Well, firewalls can help us prevent those recon attacks as well. So it's not the kind of attack that at first is destructive to your network, but when they get the information they want, it can become very destructive. Now, a couple of possible bad things about firewalls, and especially at first, again, I know I keep coming back to this point, but again, we've got to get used to fine-tuning our firewalls. Legitimate data might not get through the firewall, especially email. I do marvel sometimes to this day. It's like we've got things so tied down, I'm amazed that any of us can send email to each other. But unfortunately, with all the dangers of some emails out there, that's just the way it's got to be. Now, of course, everything we do has a cost, right? As far as time, as far as CPU, as far as bandwidth. Firewalls can result in a slight delay in your traffic flow. But this is usually a good trade-off, because you don't really want to say, well, I want my traffic to go faster, so I'm not going to use any firewalls. It's not a good trade-off. Now, again, you can have legitimate users coming to you at first after you first put a firewall in, and you'll say, well, I can't get to such and such now on the web, or I can't get to this server inside the network. It's just fine-tuning, and that's just part of life. It's part of what we do. Now, you can prevent some applications from working correctly again at first, and generally by blocking authentication. Now, we're certainly getting away from these, but for years my ebooks were exe files, and of course, you know, when people would email us, especially years ago, and just say, hey, you know, I can't read your ebook, I'm getting this message, and we would always say, are you at work? Because if you're at work, your firewall is probably not letting you authenticate. So again, that's just part of the deal. Now, one slip up in the config can lay waste to your network. Sounds awfully dramatic, but that's just the way it is. We have to be careful about that and what we're allowing, and that's why, again, I say just be really restrictive at first with the traffic you're allowing, and then open, you know, punch holes in the firewall, open ports as need be, let applications work as need be, but be restrictive at first when you're getting started with your firewalls. That is it for this video. When we come back, we've got a little more theory to go over. We're going to start looking at different approaches to applying your firewalls in your network, and then we're going to hit some labs with Cisco Configuration Professional. So I'll see you on the next vid.